Good afternoon, everybody. Bon appetit. Welcome to the last event of this academic year of the Global Perspective series in the School of Global and International Studies of the College of Arts and Sciences. I will let my colleague and friend Steve Sanders introduce our esteemed guest. I just wanted to signal that in the coming year we will continue to bring visitors to campus who bring different perspectives that are both from the trenches of governance service, as well as advocacy, as well as academia and research to the Global Perspective series. And as always, I'm thrilled to engage with any proposals that we receive from students, faculty, and friends about ideas for this. I didn't say what my name was. So I am Maria Bucher-Deckard. I'm Associate Dean for International Programs in the College of Arts and Sciences in the School of Global and International Studies. If you are interested in the programming that the School of Global and International Studies is featuring, please visit our website under SGIS. You can also find it under the college home website. In addition to the speaker series, we have a number of symposia. Some of them are student symposia. There's a human trafficking student symposium taking place next week. We have conferences that we are hosting, and there will be other types of events as the school is built up that are both student and faculty focused. Starting next year, just so you're aware of it and you keep an eye out for it, we will organize a number of events connected to the centenary of the beginning of World War I. And so we'll be moving between 2014 to 2017-18 to mark different parts of this very important event. And there will be many other things to come. So this is all to say thank you very much for coming. Please continue to attend our events and to be engaged with the school as it develops. We are partnering with many units across campus. And today I'm really pleased to be at the law school and to be able to collaborate with Steve Sanders on bringing Michael Guest here to you. Steve, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you. I'm delighted to see both colleagues of mine from the law school, students from the law school, as well as colleagues and students from other parts of the university as well. The new School of Global and International Studies is an important and exciting initiative. It's very much in the spirit of Herman Wells and his vision for the opportunities and the global reach that this university would have. And I'm really pleased. This may be the first official collaboration between the new School of Global and International Studies and the Maurer School of Law. So we're really happy to have you here for that, and especially happy to have our special guest, Michael Guest. Michael Guest took his education at Furman University and the University of Virginia. He then embarked on a 26-year career with the State Department, which included a range of executive-level positions, both in Washington and overseas. In 2001, former President George H.W. Bush appointed him as the United States Ambassador to Romania, a post in which he served for 3 years until 2004, and an appointment which made him America's first openly gay Senate-confirmed ambassador. You may be recalling vaguely that there was another controversy over a gay ambassador during the Clinton administration, James Hormel. James Hormel was indeed appointed by President Clinton. He was a recess appointment, and so he was never actually confirmed by the Senate. When Ambassador Guest retired from the State Department in 2007, where he had most recently served as a dean of the Foreign Service Institute, which trains diplomats, trains foreign service officers for the State Department, he displayed what the New York Times called uncommon courage in making clear that his resignation had been prompted by the government's failure to treat the partners of gay and lesbian foreign service officers in an equal manner with the spouses of heterosexual foreign service officers. I felt compelled, he said, to choose between my obligations to my partner, who is my family, and my service to my country. Ambassador Guest now works as an independent consultant and speaker on organizational leadership and diversity issues. In addition, he's a senior advisor to the Council for Global Equality, a coalition of 21 human rights and LGBT advocacy organizations, which is devoted toward working toward U.S. policies which are supportive of LGBT fair policies overseas. He also serves on the board of the National Security Education Program, and in addition to this program today, Ambassador Guest will be speaking tomorrow at a national conference that IU is hosting on business language education and educating the next generation of global professionals. I understand this is his first visit to Bloomington. We hope it will not be his last. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Michael Guest.
Actually, professor would be a step up. Yeah. Listen, thank you for that generous introduction, and also thank you, Maria, for getting in touch and inviting me. The truth is, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Maria. She has enormous powers of persuasion. She is, after all, of Romanian descent, and Romanians can be very, very pushy. You said it. No, but there's a lot that Steve referred to that I'm not going to talk about formally, but I think the goal is for us to, for me to make some remarks and then us have a conversation, and I look forward to that the most. I should start by thanking all of you for being here today, because I know, I vaguely recall what it's like to be at a university, and there are lots and lots of distractions, some of them perhaps more necessary than others, particularly as you get closer to exams, so I am grateful for your time. And this is my first time at Indiana University. But I tell you, walking around the campus, I feel like I've been here 100 times. It's because I'm a huge basketball fan. We talked about this last night. I mean, basketball is why I went to Furman University. It was at low cost, but it was the closest university to me, and it had a good basketball tradition. Then I went to UVA. Why? Because it has a good basketball tradition. I was not a serious student, okay? So there's hope for some of you yet. I'm a little sad that I picked Indiana to win the NCAAs this year, and you all said that's the way I feel. You know, being here, I expected to come here at a time when this campus would be going crazy because of the finals. So I missed that, and my brackets are all busted. I'm out of the tournament, as you are, but I did manage to go and get the shirt. I've been there, I got the t-shirt, and I'll be pulling for next year, because I'm sure you're going to have a very strong team next year too. Now, I've been asked to speak with you today about the question of the role that our country can play in pressing for fairness and equal rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender minorities overseas around the world. And I'm going to start by saying something right up front that Steve has already said, which is that I'm gay. And the reason I say that is that I'm steeped in the world of Washington, where if you don't put something on the table at the start, then someone later comes around and accuses you of having hidden it, that you have a hidden conflict of interest, and maybe that you've engaged in some sort of cover-up. I think it's been pretty widely advertised that I'm gay, in fact, in part because of my decision to leave a career that I genuinely love because of issues of fairness from our government. And I would say that being gay probably theoretically gives me a self-interest in the topic that we have. I mean, to be honest, I've been more observant in life at inequalities that I see attached to LGBT people around the world throughout my time in the Foreign Service, and certainly since in my work with the NGO advocacy community. But I speak to this issue today not because I'm gay. I speak to it as a lifelong practitioner and student of American diplomacy, someone who as a boy wanted nothing more than to serve his country, and then did so proudly for almost 3 decades of my life in the Foreign Service. I take very seriously the question of what it means to be an American. And I take equally seriously the question of how the United States represents that meaning to other countries. And I also care very passionately that our country not step back from using its rather unique leadership role in the world to help create a better world, because we have immense powers and opportunities to do so. So the question of America's role in advancing LGBT rights, from my perspective, kind of sits astride these two central interests of mine. And the conversation I'd like us to have today is roughly about 3 things. First, why it's right for the United States to actually be involved in advocating as part of its foreign policy for the fair and equal treatment of LGBT people in other countries. Second, the manner in which law can and cannot contribute to that advocacy, and there's something to say about both of those. And then third, some specific steps that I think our government can be taking and should be taking to follow up on that mission. And since I really do want this to be a conversation, I'm going to try to move through the remarks rather rapidly and hope that we'll have some give and take on this. To help you understand my optic on this, I want to tell you a little bit about how I was shaped as a diplomat. Some of you, I can easily see, were not even born when I joined the Foreign Service back in 1981. Seems like a long time ago to me. I started my career right out of grad school, and those were the days of Ronald Reagan, the evil empire. My framing at that time was all on strategic security. And I was a NATO policy expert. That's what I focused on in my latter years of my training at university. My focus was really security strategy, allied relations, arms control. I worked in nuclear arms control. Then I worked in bilateral U.S.-Soviet arms control talks. And eventually I worked in the negotiations, the so-called 2+4 negotiations that led to the rise of a modern unified Germany. And then suddenly, I don't know, I had almost this bifurcation in my career. The Berlin Wall came down. Countries in Eastern Europe were gradually becoming, reaching out to claim democracy as their goal. And so I saw a different need, which was to try to help those new democracies understand what that meant, understand what the word democracy meant in terms of strengthening institutions and civil society, respecting the rights of individual, taking on the practices of good governance, although we're not always the best to teach that, perhaps. There were a lot of people in those days, in the early part of my career, in particular, Reagan administration, who were very, very big on believing that confrontation was the quickest path and the best path to get what we wanted in life. And I worked with a lot of them, particularly in Moscow, particularly in Geneva, in the negotiations. And since those old days, many of those same people have now recycled. Many of them were in the previous Bush administration. And they believe that in a world that's scarred by tyranny on one hand or terrorism on the other, that the softer powers of freedom, individual rights, really have to be put aside or at least put in check in some respects to build that better world. And that our position in the world today gives us the power and the authority and the right to tell other people what to do and how to do it. I'm not one of those people. I'm not. I never have been. And I've always believed, from the time I joined the Foreign Service, that really the whole question of what the government should be doing is promoting dialogue, promoting exchanges, observing procedures that are followed in international law, observing procedures that are followed in international diplomacy as well, and that the protection of rights, of individual rights, really is important to the world that we seek. And I've always believed that any country's foreign policy really has to be attached to what the country believes in, that ours in particular has to be attached to those principles, those underlying principles about democracy, that these democratic precepts are important to who we are as a people and as a country, and that they really are the essence of America's pull to other countries who have looked to the United States through 5 decades or more of leadership to bring that same understanding of international rights and individual rights to their shores and to their doors. And I know, and I think all of you know, surely you know, that democracy as a form of government cannot be imposed. We can't just tell a government, okay, you will be democratic. We know that democracy really is a very painful at times and slow investment into the institutions, into rule of law, checks and balances, protections of rights, freedoms of expression and speech. All of these things are important to what democracy is, and they have to be taught, they have to be gradually assimilated over time. When we stand up for these principles, I believe we make the world a safer place. We make it a place where there's less need to have recourse to law, to war, to torture, to shrinkings of freedom in any respect. And we help inspire and create the world in which American interests and values really can thrive. So that's my framing, and that's the frame in which I place the question of what our country can and should be doing on the question of urging that LGBT people around the world be accorded the same rights as others. I co-founded the Council for Global Equality, which Steve mentioned 5 years ago when I left the State Department, out of a belief that the United States government had, over time, fairly consistently ignored the plight of LGBT people around the world. At that time, there was very little reference in human rights reports that the State Department would produce to LGBT people. And I think that was largely for political reasons. People were afraid of the issue in Washington. They were unsure how to intervene in an issue that had such resonance, positive and negative, on Capitol Hill. And I'm proud of having co-created that organization, and I'm also proud of what this administration has done to respect the rights of LGBT people abroad, and increasingly to push as a central part of our foreign policy to ensure that America is seen as standing on the side of LGBT people. And I should say as an aside there that I was appointed in the Bush administration, but I was a career appointee. I was not a political appointee. And I actually was, originally the plan was to nominate me under Bill Clinton. And Madeleine Albright put my name forward to the White House. And then there was this election that happened, and the guy named Al Gore lost. And so my name was sent back. But fortunately, the new administration saw that I was competent in what I was doing, and so they put my name forward. But at any rate, I'm very proud of what the administration has been doing to advance this issue. I know that they faced a fair amount of controversy in the course of doing so, and frankly, I have too. I have friends, former colleagues at the State Department, who one of them said 2 years ago, "You've become too gay." And I'm like, okay, I'm not sure what that means. I should introduce you to some of my friends. But, you know, honestly, when the question is of becoming too gay, I don't know how to separate the right of individuals in another country to hold a gay rights protest or even a gay pride parade from these broader freedoms that the United States has always stood for. Freedoms of expression and speech and assembly. They're part and parcel. They really are related. I don't know, as an individual or as a foreign person, how you can sit aside and watch as a government threatens to put someone to death because he's gay. It's just not right. It doesn't fit with what we believe. I don't know how you can sit quietly when a government would impose fines on a company, including American companies, for offering any support, tangible or otherwise, to support LGBT fairness and equality. I don't know how you can sit quietly when a government would, in fact, impose fines, legal penalties, on one of its own citizens because they failed to turn in a family member or failed to mention a friend who is gay. It's just not what we believe in. It's not sound health policy to exclude men who have sex with men from HIV protection and treatment programs. It's not good, it can't be good for a community or for a country to preclude marginalized members of society, and frankly, when you're talking about LGBT people, most are marginalized in most countries of the world, so it's not right to exclude them from obtaining or holding jobs that they need to feed their families. And those of you who study law, I mean, how many of you are law students? Okay, you know this stuff. Justice deferred is justice denied. You've probably heard that a million times. And if you've ever heard the term partial equality, which strangely is bandied about at times in Washington, that term makes no sense. There is no such thing as partial equality. So to be clear, I want you to understand that I care about these things and I speak about these things not because I'm gay, but because I'm American and because I've been raised in this country as you have. And all of the principles that I've mentioned are principles that were at the heart of what I was charged to represent as a Foreign Service officer of the United States for almost 3 decades. They're also at the heart of who we are as a people, what you taught when you were a kid in school. And they're very central to the image that our country has overseas as well. In my view, if our policies at home and abroad are to carry consistency and integrity, they really have to be applied to the rights of LGBT minorities just as much as they're applied to any other minority in any other country. Now, I'm not a lawyer. To those of you who raised your hands, this is a law school, and so at my own peril, I'm going to talk a little bit about law. Please don't shoot me down. Half of my adult life, roughly half of my adult life, almost exactly, has been spent overseas. And over the course of that career, I have had foreign diplomats tell me over and over and over again that no foreigner has the right through international law to tell them what to do in their country about human rights issues. And on one level, that's more or less true. I mean, I've already said we can't impose democracy on other countries. Clearly, we can't pass laws in this country and then enact them in other countries. So it's kind of true from that perspective. But human rights are a well-established issue of concern and challenge for relations between two countries, or among many countries. Other countries can reject what we say. Other countries can refuse to engage in the dialogue, and that very often happens. But they have the right to silence our voice, and the reason is that when we speak to discrimination or human rights abuses, we're speaking from our experience, and we're stating what we believe as a matter of our policy. We're saying what we want to see reflected in the world, and we're simply being true to who we are as a people and as a country. Now, there are a lot of people who have pointed out to me that international commitments, particularly the UN Declaration on Human Rights, makes no specific reference to LGBT people. And that's true. It doesn't mention specifically straight people either, by the way. It's irrelevant that it doesn't mention a particular minority or a particular group of people, because the Universal Declaration is all about challenging other countries to respect the rights of all citizens. The Declaration says squarely that no matter what country we come from, no matter who we are, every person has inherent rights, and that it's the responsibility of governments to protect those rights. There are many people who have challenged me, saying that international protocols and conventions have been useless because they don't really land leaders of other countries, human rights abusive countries, in jail very often, and so what's the point? And the point is that these conventions and treaties and protocols are there for a different reason. They're to hold countries accountable for the commitments that they have freely signed, that they have freely made about respecting rights of their people. Now, I have a lot of other people who have trotted out other arguments to oppose any involvement of the U.S. government in human rights issues broadly and LGBT policy generally. Some worry that human rights can complicate an already complicated relationship. Can happen, does happen, but my experience is that most countries that are human rights abusive have a lot of problems. They have a lot of other issues that complicate our relations, and so I don't see this as particularly additive in that sense. And there are people who have told me that speaking to LGBT rights really is connected with some gay lobby request for special rights, and I hate that more than anything. Because the goal never has been to have special rights or to be treated differently. The goal is for LGBT people to be treated the same, exactly the same as anyone else. To have the same protections and rights and benefits and responsibilities as any other citizen is what we should expect as Americans. And those who usually complain about special rights usually are from the majority. And they're quick to see the benefit of those protections and rights, of course, for themselves. So that's all we have a right to ask for, but from my perspective, it's everything that our country really stands for. Now, those of you who are in law school are probably sitting there saying that this guy at the podium has just said, you know, international law is irrelevant. And law is irrelevant in defining the rights of gay and transgender people. And I don't want that to be the takeaway. I don't want you to say, he told me I don't have to study for my exams. What I'm saying is that we have what we need in international covenant and diplomatic practice to raise these issues and insist across borders that the rights of LGBT people be observed, and that LGBT people, like every other minority, be treated fairly. The critical importance of law really does enter at the national level in the countries that we're dealing with. you know as well as I do that if fairness is to take root in any society, then you have to fix discriminatory, unfair laws. They have to be changed. That's just foundational to the way the world works. And we don't have the power through international law to make those changes. Those fights are being handled and carried on at the domestic level, usually in parliaments, sometimes in the court, but usually in parliaments. More often than not, gay rights advocates are fighting to repeal laws, and sometimes they're fighting to enact new protections in law. And in the meantime, the opponents of gay rights are scurrying around trying to find new, harsher ways to tweak and fine-tune the laws to make them even worse. This is called, in some countries, a process, which I don't quite understand. It's not a process. There's no reasoned dialogue. There's no intelligent debate on the parliamentary floors on any of the horrible laws that are being considered in places like Uganda, Nigeria, Malawi. We could go on. That being said, I should add that I lived in Washington a long time, and there's often not a lot of intelligent debate going on our floor either. And what I've found more remarkable, though, that is even when governments seek to change laws in a positive direction, when they try to do the right thing, very often there's no real debate there either. And the clearest example is in the case of the European Union and the countries that have recently joined the European Union or aspire to join the European Union. Very often the citizens are simply told, to join the EU, we have to do this, we have to pass this law, and then bam, it's done. And it's over and it's done. But there's never been any effort to lay the groundwork and explain to citizens why it needs to be done. What's the reasoning behind this law? Or in fact, to explain to the police enforcement agencies that have to enforce the law why and how to enforce it. So in some respects, that makes the law harder to enforce, harder to anchor, harder to understand. As foreigners, particularly as foreign diplomats, we rarely get invited into those chambers and those private rooms where the key decisions are taken about a particular law that is being decided at that time. And nor, of course, do we get to vote on laws as they're passed or, in some cases, rescinded. But I think we have a very important role, and it sometimes is a critical role, in filling that information gap and explaining, being part of the process of explaining to citizens why this law is being considered. In the case of the European Union, I think too often they've failed to do that. We're not part of the European Union, but that doesn't mean we can't be part of saying why a law is particularly important. So beyond that, that sort of is the power of the pulpit, if you want to call it that. Presidents and secretaries of state and ambassadors and embassies have this enormous power, I think, to shape those kinds of debates. I want to get beyond that. I do want to give one more example, though, of a speech that was very important in shaping this debate recently. A speech by Hillary Clinton in December 2011 in Geneva. Does that ring a bell with anyone? She gave a speech on LGBT rights in Geneva at the UN headquarters in Geneva. It was an enormously powerful speech. It was magnificent. And if you've not read it or heard about it, just Google it and read it. I had advocated for a speech for about 2 years. There are many others who had joined in that advocacy. And so when she gave the speech, I flew to Geneva to hear it. And she was extraordinarily skilled, I guess, in the way that she sort of spoke with humility about an issue that she acknowledged is very difficult in our own country and in many countries. And the way she framed the issue sort of moved the question out of that parliamentary process or out of the bureaucratic inbox of laws we must pass and really talked about it in a way that sort of took the debate into communities and into families. And ultimately, that's where I think this debate really needs to take place. But beyond that speaking ability, beyond that ability to put an idea out there and get it to citizens of a country, there's a lot I think that the United States can do, some of which it is doing, in more concrete ways to support the kinds of change that we see. The United States has bilateral legal assistance programs with a countless range of countries around the world. Those bilateral assistance programs can be used, there can be a dialogue about using them to help countries edge toward greater fairness for LGBT people. We provide training for police forces, and why not use some of that training to, in fact, help police forces understand how to safeguard minority rights. In our public diplomacy, I think we need to speak out more regularly and including at senior levels whenever the rights of LGBT people are violated, in the same way that we speak out when the rights of Coptic Christians are violated and others. The State Department has a function called the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, who has, as far as I'm aware, to date not spoken out on questions of persecution against LGBT affirming churches and congregations, and there have been a number of those cases. So that is a tool and a resource that can be used. We have assistance programs, microcredit, judicial fairness and democracy promotion, various reform programs, public health programs, rule of law programs. We have a huge range of assistance programs in our quiver that can be used to reach out to marginalized communities in the same way we reach out through those programs to other minority communities. I think there's more that can be done in the HIV area. Senior governments really should be affirming more regularly the importance of including LGBT populations in those programs. And this may be controversial. I personally believe that PEPFAR funds, those are the funds that are used to treat and prevent HIV in other countries, probably should be denied, if possible, to organizations that actually promote anti-gay messages, promote anti-gay legislation, and thereby undercut both sound health policy and U.S. government policy. We can talk about that more because I don't believe in a draconian cut, the way it's been suggested internationally by the British Prime Minister, for example, but I think there are ways to edge in that direction. And I think we need to do a better job of coordinating our assistance programs with those of the World Bank and other MDBs, multilateral development banks, that are involved in this space, and just so that we can assure better reach and better impact for our programs. But the most important set of actions we can take overall are those that align our support with what LGBT groups on the ground identify as their primary obstacles and needs. We can do a much better job at listening. I think LGBT groups should be included in the civil society groups that we invite to the ambassador's table, to the ones that we invite to capacity building and advocacy skill training programs. We should engage foreign LGBT groups on the content and framing of our public diplomacy so that we understand better maybe what messages resonate best in a particular country and maybe what messengers carry the right credibility. There are things that we can do that we have not been doing in terms of forming legal clinics for some of the advocacy organizations overseas, maybe offering pro bono assistance or putting organizations in touch with the lawyers who can provide some pro bono assurances and background and information and ideas for how to approach a particular law. We could bring more LGBT leaders to this country from overseas and have them meet with American civil rights leaders and LGBT rights leaders to help them understand the obstacles that have been faced in this country, how they've been faced, and take away from those conversations whether in fact those same strategies apply or not for them. And in terms of the capacity building, just to focus in on that more, I think we really need to do more on the leadership skills of some of these organizations. I've been amazed in the time that I've left government and have started working with LGBT groups internationally, how many of them really have people who are in desperate circumstances, and they have not just hearts of gold, they have courage beyond belief in facing authorities on what they consider to be rights that we take for granted. And yet they don't really have the training, the leadership skill training, in how to build teams and how to build alliances with other organizations, strategic planning and skills, communication skills, emergency action skills. All of these things are very important to any organization. And what we've had the tendency to do over the history of the time I've been in Washington is throw money at problems. And you sort of give a grant, and it's very loosely sketched out, and you give money, and then you expect to get a report back eventually, but it's not really tuned to what the needs are. You can't just give computers. That's another thing. You have surplus computers, give it to an NGO, or you have spare office equipment. We can't do that. We really need to invest in the people who can make the change happen, and the people that we are in fact encouraging to pursue their rights in accordance with American traditions. ultimately, I think the people on the ground are the ones that have to make the change. It's not the U.S. government that makes the change. But we can invest in them in the same way we invest in women's groups and the rights of ethnic minorities like the Roma, the same way we invest in the rights of racial minorities and the groups that are related to that. Our goal is to lift them up, and we should be able to do that in the same fashion for LGBT groups that we've been doing it for decades for some of these other groups. I will say, I mean, I'm not here as a political spokesperson, but you know, the Obama administration has been incredibly good on this issue. I actually put a lot of that at the feet of Hillary Clinton. She has gotten this issue in the same way she got women's rights issues many years ago in Beijing. And she's been very determined. She has been a go-to person in trying to deal with LGBT rights. And she has approached it correctly, not as a separate little bucket of people or issues. She's approached it as, what is our human rights policy designed to do? Why do we have a human rights policy, and who are we excluding? And LGBT groups are the groups that have been excluded in the past. But she has been great on it, and President Obama has been as well. And increasingly, the issue of LGBT rights is being folded into our foreign policy, into our human rights policy, where it should be. Now, this is probably the appropriate place for me to stop talking, because I really do want us to get to that conversation. But just to leave you with a few points, I hope you believe, as I do, that human rights really don't stop at water's edge. And if you believe that, and if you're determined, as I am, that human rights policy carry that consistency, then I think there is a lot that we can do as a country to promote a greater understanding of the need to advance LGBT rights internationally. And I hope that I've helped you see some of the possibilities in what we can do. I really do believe that America's prestige is wasted if we're not trying to use that prestige and use the tools and the programs that we have to create this better world that we always talk about wanting to create. We are as creative a country as there are out there. We are very compassionate in the way we approach the rights of individuals in every other walk of life. So there is much more that can be done to advance the same cause in relation to LGBT rights. For those of you that are considering a career in law, I will say that the world of LGBT rights is not an easy one. It's not very profitable either, and I know you're going to leave here with some bills to pay. But there's always a need out there. And from my perspective, having worked in the government and now the NGO community, there's nothing better to do than to know that you're contributing in some way to really building this better world that we all seek. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn the conversation over to you. I'm not sure if I turn it over to Steve or...
We don't have to do that. First. Questions? We'll let you choose.
Okay. Because you have brighter colors, we'll start with you. So I'll come back to you in a second.
Thanks. You obviously have approached these issues from a top-down perspective, and I just wanted to say that as a former Peace Corps volunteer, from the more like grassroots level, I think you're absolutely right in the special role that these more information kind of campaigns need to play. That we need to do more than just have strict results-based approaches to advance LGBT rights in these countries. But my question is, there have been a lot of these. There have been some legislative attempts to protect LGBT people through both a carrot and stick approach. Like in Uganda, the kill gay people bill was stopped the first time by threats to rescind U.S. funding to the country, and then there's the alternative more carrot gentle approach of maybe incentivizing countries to provide more comprehensive LGBT inclusive education in their programs. So I was wondering if you have a perspective on the roles of those more like coercive legislative actions and whether or not they have an important role to play, whether one might be more influential or impactful than the other.
Carrots and sticks, you talk like Henry Kissinger. Listen, the Council for Global Equality was very heavily involved in this issue about the Kill the Gays bill in Uganda, and we pushed on the administration very relentlessly to do some really important things. Because I think you can't just preach in public and say, don't do this bill. Countries have their own political processes and their own political dynamics, and a lot of the issue of the legislation in Uganda is being really driven by those constituencies. A lot of it's also being driven by some conservative Christian groups who they are empowered to their thought, but they have been pushing for more rigorous legislation. I mean, Uganda already has a bill that penalizes LGBT people. So this bill is designed to sort of ratchet it up. Let's put a few to death, and honestly, it's just beyond the pale. The Obama administration actually did a lot behind the scenes, and that's what we were trying to encourage. Not the public campaigns as much as working with individual conversations at the level of the president, the secretary, the assistant secretary, the deputy assistant secretary, the desk officers, and making sure that that message was consistent when there's a trade mission, when there was any sort of congressional contact, making sure that the message kept coming across, this bill is wrong, and it's wrong for these reasons, and we ask that you not put it forward. Now, that bill did not pass, but it's still there. It still is on the docket, and it's going to come up again, and it probably will fail again if the assurances that have been given at senior levels that it won't be signed into law, or that it won't muster the votes, or it won't get its place in the calendar, if any of those assurances come through, it won't pass again. But then it'll come up again, and it'll keep coming up. And there is a fair amount of determination in that country, in some of these conservative groups, to make sure that it passes. We have to stay on top of it. And I think, frankly, the better approach is to have this dialogue about it than using necessarily a carrot or necessarily a stick. I'm not I've never been in the camp of either carrots or sticks. I think you have to look at opportunities that present themselves. And so if, let's say, a leader of Uganda wants to come to the United States, maybe the leader of the Uganda should not be invited to come to the United States if, in fact, at that time, it looks like that leader of Uganda is about to help with the passage of that bill. But if that leader of Uganda, this is all, hypothetical, if that leader is actually instrumental in trying to stop it, then maybe there is an appropriate opportunity to use that as a carrot. So I think you have to be very careful about how you approach this, and most of it is better done quietly than publicly. I do support some of the public campaigns that have gone on, particularly on that bill. I think Rachel Maddow has been a savior on the issue and shining a light on it. There's a group called All Out, maybe some of you know, that launches these appeals from time to time. I support those appeals, but there's a limit to what you can do when you take a position in such a public way that leaders in the other country feel that they're up against the wall, that they're being judged in a public way, because then they have their constituency issues that start to come in play. And so you really do have to be careful and nuanced in the way that you frame it. And from time to time, having someone on the outside rattle the drums and the tin cans is very, very helpful. And other times it may not be. One of the things that I've tried to do within the Council for Global Equality is work with some of the traditional activists in the human rights community and the LGBT advocacy community to understand how you make that intersection with the government in an office sometimes, rather than in a press release or in a demonstration in front of an embassy or the State Department. Because you really do have to think in a measured way about the most effective way of getting the work done. And that applies not just to Uganda, but any of the countries where we see LGBT travesties, in many cases true tragedies, going on. It's to work behind the scenes and figure out where the right balance of carrots and sticks happen to be. Does that answer? You had a question.
Thank you. As you know, we may be in a period right now what seems like accelerating progress on LGBT rights. Repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, President changing his position on marriage equality, the referenda last fall in the elections, possibly the Supreme Court overturning DOMA. I just wondered whether you had seen yet what effect, if any, those domestic changes in progress were having on the efforts to promote LGBT rights overseas, and also whether you think the last 30, 40 years and those sort of victories offer any particular lessons for efforts overseas as well.
That's a very good question and a very complex one, so I'll try to get to it as I can. First of all, in a lot of countries overseas, there's been enormous change in the way people view LGBT rights that has mirrored but lagged behind what is happening here in the United States. We don't have the capacity to, my organization doesn't have the capacity to track the changes country by country, and some of those countries don't have very good polling or don't poll on this issue. But we certainly see it in the lives of people that we talk to in LGBT organizations internationally, and sometimes we see it in polls too. I think a lot of people look to the lead of the United States, and it's not because they're trying to follow us, it's because they're trying to understand us. And when this debate explodes domestically about LGBT rights and whether it's employment issues or domestic partnership benefits or DOMA or marriage, they're reading the press and they're getting these stories on an issue that they're not, in some cases, it's not even crossed the national threshold yet. But it's having the effect of pulling the countries along and understanding what the issue of rights is all about. The council and many of the other organizations that we work with have had a lot of internal conversations about what happens when the Supreme Court issues its ruling on DOMA in particular that case. Because we have tried very hard to make sure that countries understand that this is not all about marriage. The things that are happening to LGBT people in many parts of the world are just, things that you never even think of in this country, in terms of being put to death or hounded, or public campaigns in the press to embarrass them and hurt their families, people losing jobs and in some cases almost losing their lives, or in some cases they have lost their lives. So we don't want the debate to be distorted internationally overseas, that this is all about marriage, because marriage is, for many people, for my parents, it's they don't like the fact that I wear this ring. So it's something we try to draw that line. At the same time, we're trying to work with the U.S. government now to understand that there should be implications for the United States if the marriage ruling comes out right. I mean, there are issues that will affect gay and lesbian foreign service officers. The reason, as Steve said, that I left the department was because they wouldn't change these regulations regarding foreign service officers, and then I worked in the Obama transition team with Hillary to actually have all that reversed. 5 months later, it was history. But so what happens when marriage is recognized? Well, there still will be a lot of foreign service officers who can't get married in their own states, is my bet. I mean, you lawyers, you can tell me what's going to happen in the Supreme Court. So there still are implications for not cutting off benefits just because people cannot, in fact, get married in their own states. Overseas, there are some groups that we're talking to in some countries overseas that are very much interested in the marriage debate here because it started there a little bit, and they're looking to profit from that debate to carry it forward. And there's some other groups that say, please do not let this be brought into our discussion of the horrible travesties that we're facing. So we're trying to walk that line. And I'm not sure what the administration will do. I mean, the administration has gone from a position, as you know, of the president saying it's not for us at the federal level, to saying he's turned around on the issue personally, to saying we're not going to enforce DOMA. Not that we're going to undercut it by pulling back police enforcements, but we're not going to take it to the Supreme Court and defend it as a law. So I think there's a question in my mind on what they will do that will have an impact internationally, because certainly if DOMA is reversed, the administration will applaud it. And certainly our embassies are going to be asked, what does that mean in your country? And they're going to be asked, what does it mean in our country? So there's going to be a lot of needlepoint work, I guess you'd say, that needs to be done with the State Department and trying to figure out what the best messaging is that will advance the cause of fairness and equality without necessarily complicating it for countries that aren't ready for that debate yet.
Hi, my question is about democracy. Do you think that there is any hope for LGBT rights in countries that are or less democratic? Or is democracy like always a necessary first step to embracing those rights?
Well, first of all, a lot of the countries that are not terribly democratic still very often claim that they want to be, and they still sign on to commitments saying that they are democratic, even if you know that's not true. I think democracy gives more openings for civil society to be engaged, and that's the key thing that I think we should try to support. In countries where there really is not a strong, resilient civil society, it's a much harder task. From my perspective, you have to look at any of these issues from the standpoint of the arc of history and how history does change over time. Developments happen that cause countries to feel like they have to move forward with one advancement. It could be in the health area, it could be in science, it could be in the invitation to be part of the governing circle. It could be a revolution that overturns an existing government. So you have to look at it from that standpoint and expect that over time there are going to be developments that will cause, even in those countries that are not democratic at all, will cause the issue of LGBT rights to move forward. But honestly, I think regardless of what happens at a governmental level overseas, and in one of perhaps the more autocratic countries overseas, or the Middle East being a good example, there still is a lot that the U.S. can and should be doing to put the issue on the table and to get people to understand, whether it's publicly in some cases through a speaker series or privately through those one-on-one conversations, that LGBT people deserve the same rights. Let me go this side and come back because I've had my back this way.
I would be curious to hear a little bit more about how you use the power of the pulpit in Romania and how you use also informal conversation with officials to advocate for LGBT people. And I was in Romania in 2001, and you remember that you were fiercely attacked by some newspapers that, because you were gay. And I remember that your position was kind of complicated, not just from the perspective of the U.S. administration, but also from the perspective of what was happening there. And well, in 2006, I was part of the Gay Pride in Bucharest, and I think the Gay Pride happened in Bucharest also because your involvement in these issues in Romania. So I would thank you for that.
Okay, you've asked a very complicated question that brings back a lot of bad memories, actually. It was not easy. It was not easy. I always felt as ambassador, though, that I was more supported by the Romanian government than I was by my own. I'll put that on the table. These attacks against me in the press occurred from Vadim Tudor's paper largely. But only after I made clear I was not going to meet with him because he was so irredentist. He wanted to take back part of Bulgaria. He had positions on all sorts of issues that were just anathema to us, and the U.S. had a policy of not meeting with him at that level because we knew that what would end up would be a handshake on the front page of his newspaper, and we did not want to encourage that. There were lower level conversations that would keep that dialogue going about why their policies were wrong. As soon as I made clear that I would not meet with him, that's when the attacks began. And in response to those attacks, Washington said, tamp that down. Don't put this issue out there. We don't want this to be an issue in the bilateral relationship. And I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do about it? Because I happen to be gay and he's attacking me because I'm gay. What am I supposed to do about it? Whereas the Romanian government, at least, put out statements making very clear that they respected me as a diplomat, that I had professional qualifications, that I was bringing to the table, that I cared about the country, and I was interested in seeing progress in the bilateral relationship, support for NATO membership, all those kinds of things. And so you may remember that. So it's a very complex thing for me to understand how a foreign government could be more supportive in some respects than my government was at the time of its own ambassador. Similarly, it was very difficult for me to embrace the cause of gay rights and, you know, put a gay pride flag on my shoulders or something, because I knew that would create complications for any other LGBT ambassador who might ever be appointed. In fact, it would be a discouragement. You don't, in the world of diplomacy, want to have an activist ambassador. You want to have an ambassador that represents the interests of the United States. And I was very much aware of that. I was very much aware that I was the personal representative of the president, which all ambassadors are, and that president was George Bush, and this was an administration that was not terribly warm and friendly on LGBT issues. So I was careful to understand that an ambassador is not a freelance agent. You don't go out to a country and say, oh, well, let's do this. You know, you have policies that are worked out in consultation with the State Department, with the other agencies of the U.S. government who are active in that country. And so I always kept that at the forefront of my agenda. That's what I was there to do. But the fact that I was there, and as an openly gay man, did create a lot of, leave aside the press thing, the negative press things, it created a lot of conversation. It created conversation every time I met with a mayor or a council member in one of the Judettes or another, where somehow or another the issue would come up. Sometimes it would be, they would raise it by saying, we're so sorry that you've had these attacks, or they'd say something like that, but that would give me a positive opportunity to say, this is what a democracy is, and this is how it works, and that I was proud to be gay. I was proud to come from a country where the fact that I was gay didn't keep me from getting this kind of a job. And then to talk about the issues in Romania. And I could sit down and talk in the Prime Minister's home about the issues. Usually he would raise them. So I had a dialogue with a lot of people across government and also in towns and cities. The longer I was there, the more I was surprised. I mean, I really hadn't intended to talk about this much, but the longer I was surprised to see how, for Romanian people, it didn't seem to matter after a certain point, because they saw me as standing for the things they wanted to stand. They wanted their country to be a member of NATO, a member of the European Union. They wanted their country to be known as a less corrupt country, and I was pushing on the corruption issue. They wanted fairness in their country. They wanted a lot of the principles and the values that I talked about as my presentation. And when you had those private conversations, you realize that people are people, and they have the capacity to look beyond the label. That's true in this country too. I have pictures of me dancing with peasant women all over the country, these big, strong women who swung me around after, you know, 3 glasses of Palinka, and they could swing me anywhere. Where it didn't matter, the fact that I was gay just did not matter. And I think people saw me by the time I left, more or less saw me as someone who was a friend of the country and who was trying to move the country in the right direction. There was one example in my last few weeks. I went to a church in Timișoara in the western part of the country and was saying goodbye. My dad, who is a Southern Baptist pastor, had come along, and he actually gave a sermon. And so here we were in this church, and in the receiving line, as everyone was leaving, this one guy came up and said, "We're so sorry to have you leave. You're so great. You're so wonderful. We know that you love this country and you have the interest in the heart. You're so much better than that former homosexual ambassador." Okay. Okay. But you do have to represent what your country stands for, and you have to represent the president. And so the balance I tried to take was, okay, I'm not out there to promote gay rights, but I am an example, a living example of a gay person. And if you've never seen one before, this is what they look like, and this is what they care about, the same things you care about. And I'm still representing the principles and the values of my country and the interests of my country. And these are the things I've talked about that I think found resonance in Romania.
So that people can get to class and
yes,
other obligations, I think we need to close the program. And David and Susan, I haven't warned you about this, but one of the programs at the law school that has brought great distinction and great note to the law school is the Center on Constitutional Democracy. Leadership for that is provided by Professor David Williams and Professor Susan Williams. For those of you who may be interested in that, I hope it's not too late. You have an information session coming up, is that right?
We did it last week.
Okay, is the application process still open for students to be JD affiliates with the center? Okay, is the information on the website? Okay, on the website for the season. Okay, the Center on Constitutional Democracy. So if you were interested in getting involved in democracy building work and thinking about some of these issues, particularly in developing countries, the role the constitutions play in mediating difference, that's the work that this center is about. So there's an opportunity there as a student to be involved in the center. So thank you so much.
Thank you.